Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Paul Shackel, author of Remembering Lattimer.
Paul Shackel, author of Remembering Lattimer, Labor, Migration, and Race in Pennsylvania Anthracite Country. You write in your book, Lattimer is the largest labor massacre in 19th century America, yet it has been mostly forgotten in the national public memory. Why has it been mostly forgotten?
Well, that was the key, and that's the key for the whole book. You know, why has Lattimer been forgotten? And I think about some of the great strikes in American history. The Haymarket riot. I mean, that's been well documented, and the Ludlow massacre. People know it very well, and so it was really interesting when I started reading history books and looking for Lattimer, and they weren't in there. Reading books about labor history and labor strikes, Lattimer's missing. And so I looked at Howard Zinn's book, and Howard Zinn wrote The People's History of the United States, which is very much a left-of-center perspective, and he writes a lot about labor and labor history, and it wasn't in there either. It was only a footnote when describing the sinking of the Maine, okay? So that was kind of unusual. So I thought this was something that we really had to look at. It's one of the largest labor massacres in U.S. history, and it's not in the national public memory. So why could that be? Well, part of it is that Lattimer was pretty much on the rural front, in a rural area, and it got some coverage. The massacre in the court hearings got some coverage by local as well as some national papers, but then it disappears about a year after, and people don't really write about it afterwards. And if they do, the perspectives of the massacre changes over time. Was it because it was sort of out in the country? Was it because these are mostly the people who died here were they immigrants and who did not speak English, and therefore their voices were not told, and they couldn't tell their story? Or was it something related to the battle between labor and capital, where labor wanted the incident to be known, and the UMWA wanted the incident to be known, but capital fought against memorializing the victims of Lattimer. So you have all these different variables in creating this historical amnesia where it disappears for a while, but it disappears on the national scene. But what's amazing to me is that the story was kept alive, and it was kept alive by the local people. It was kept alive by people telling stories one generation after another to the next generation and to the next generation. And people knew about it. The local people knew about it. And so it was something that I thought was important to the local community, and therefore it was important to make it part of the larger national public memory. And that's what this book is trying to do. It's taking these memories from the local people. It's taking some of the literature that didn't quite make it on the national level, and putting it all together to make the story about Lattimer relevant and important for the national public.
Just a little bit of background. Where is Lattimer?
So Lattimer is in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's just outside of Hazleton. So when the coal patch towns are being created, these towns are being developed in in areas where there are coal mines. So Hazleton was a big commercial center, but Lattimer was just outside of it. There's a mine there, so the company builds some houses. And then, and so when you go into Lattimer today, there's a set of double houses as you enter town. And then on the periphery, there were these little enclaves where the new immigrants came and where the new immigrants lived. So what I found in the case of Lattimer is that when the new immigrants came in, there wasn't housing for them. So the company said, there's a plot of land, build your house. And so there's these amazing descriptions of this housing for the new immigrants, where it's the Century magazine in 1898 describes these little enclaves, and they describe them as buildings and shacks and roofs slanted at different levels, and doorways without doors and windows without windows, and there's no symmetry, which is a major part of English architecture about that time. But there's little shacks or shanties in these enclaves where there wasn't much sanitation. You know, people would throw their slop in the alleys and in the streets and so forth. And that's what a lot of the early coal patch towns were like that were developing in the 1880s and 1890s. So northeastern Pennsylvania is an area where coal was the big issue there, and coal became what was called black diamonds, right? Because there was money associated with coal, and so it's not until coal is first discovered in the 1760s, 1770s, and historians will debate whether it's 1768 or 1775. But what's important is about in the 1820s is when coal becomes a major product where people are excavating the coal and beginning to dig deep into mines to extract coal, and then start sending the coal to the East Coast to heat houses, to run businesses and industries, and by the 1850s, coal is king, and there's several men who really make a lot of money, and they make a lot of money on the backs of these new immigrants who are coming into the country. Okay,
where were the immigrants from?
And the immigrants come from different parts of the world, depending on the time and depending on the social and political circumstances at the time. The earliest coal miners were coming from England and Scotland, and so when I say the earliest coal miners, that's the 1820s, 1830s or so. And by the 1840s, it's the Irish, and the Irish come into the region, and they become the laborers who are working hard and digging coal in the coal mines, and they're associated with the story of the Molly Maguires, which we could go into a little bit later. But then by the 1880s and 1890s, people from southern and eastern Europe are coming into northeastern Pennsylvania. They're being recruited to come into northeastern Pennsylvania.
We recruited from Europe to come to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so coal miners are sending agents into Europe to bring people to northeastern Pennsylvania. Not every coal operator did that, but a lot of coal operators did. And so there was a strategy, and the strategy was to import as many laborers as you could, to the point where there was a lot of people who were hungry and a lot of people who were not employed. And so the strategy was to have this large workforce partially unemployed, so that when people went on strike, or if people were killed in the mines, or if they were injured in the mines, it was easy to replace them. So these workers, these new immigrants who were coming in, were seen as almost like cogs in a wheel, right? And so that they were easily replaceable. And so what we have in the 1880s and 1890s is this massive immigration coming in from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and to the point where people are afraid of them. And people are afraid of them because they speak a different language, they wear different clothes, they worship differently than the quote-unquote English speakers. And so, so we begin to see all this xenophobic fear developing, too, in that area.
I want to point out something. You have a chart in your book that is from the U.S. Immigration Commission from 1911, and it lists the race preferred by mining operators for specific occupations. And for a pick miner, the lowest level is American English, Welsh, Irish, but then Lithuanian, Polish, Slovak, Ruthenian, Belgian, Italian. And then the fire bosses are American English and Scotch, engineers, German, American English, Irish, foremen. The higher levels tend to be the ones who more likely to speak English.
And of course, right? And so, and the new immigrants are the ones who are at the bottom of that. And so what you're looking at is a report that was created by the U.S. Senate in 1911. And that pretty much summarizes the xenophobic fears and the creation of hierarchies based on race that was developing mostly in the discipline of anthropology in the 1870s and 80s, where people are categorized based on skin color or places of origin. And if you look at that chart too, it even separates the Italians from the northern Italians and the southern Italians. And people are coming from southern Italy because of from the poverty, you know, and they want to leave Italy. And that's partially my heritage too, where my family came from southern Italy over here. So this xenophobic fear and the scientific racism that's being developed during this time period creates these organizations that are afraid of the new immigrants, and they're afraid that their American culture is going to change, that they won't have this white Anglo culture anymore. And so Teddy Roosevelt commissioned the Senate to do this study, and the study is 42 volumes. It's like this, okay?
How much of it did you read?
Well, I read bits and pieces, but I did not read 42 volumes. But when you start reading it, it's amazing to see how that language is so coded with racism based on our modern perspectives of race and racism, where people from Southern and Eastern Europe are not considered human in some points, in some parts. And so can they actually work in the mines? You know, can they take instructions? Are they intelligent enough? And these were all questions that develop. And there's this one volume, there's volume 5 of that immigration report, which was developed by anthropologists. So I'm an anthropologist, right? And so it's just, for me, it's, well, shocking, but also sad to see how anthropology played a role in creating these racial hierarchies like this. So, so that's what's governing the principles of the hiring and the hierarchies in the labor force there.
So your book is about the Lattimer Massacre, so we probably shouldn't get too far into this without talking about what the Lattimer Massacre was, what happened that day.
Sure. Okay. So here we have, and what we just talked about was perfect, because we have these different racial categories that have been created, and that's part of the American culture, the American psyche. And so a lot of these new workers who are from Eastern and Southern Europe are doing the same work as the English speakers, right? But they're being paid less. They're being paid 10, 15% less than the English speakers. And this is a point of contention, and there's lots a lot of people have written letters and notes, and you've seen newspapers how the Hungarians, who are the Eastern Europeans, how the Hungarians are willing to work at far less wages. Well, after a while, they get ticked off. If they're doing the same amount of work, they want the same amount of wage. And so there's a series of incidents that occur in 1897. The state legislators passed the Campbell Act. And the Campbell Act is also known as the Alien Tax Act. And the Alien Tax Act is a tax on foreign workers who are not U.S. citizens. It's a 3 cents tax. And
3 cents per day.
3 cents per day. Yeah, exactly. And so this is 1897. We're just coming out of a major recession. The coal miners are working 2 to 3 days a week. They're not working 5 or 6 days a week. They're working 2 or 3 days a week. They're making about $1.50 a day. And when they get their paychecks, they line up to get their paychecks. And sometimes when they get their paychecks, they're left with nothing, or they owe money to the company store, right? There's that song, I owe my soul to the company store. And so they have no money. And then next thing you know, they're being deducted 3 cents a day. And they're not too happy about that, okay? And then there's some other incidents where one of the mule boys gets knocked over the head. The mule boys are protesting because they have to transport their mules at a longer distance in order to save money. But now they're working 2 hours more a day without any compensation. And so there's that incident. And they're striking, and one of the foremen actually clubs one of the kids over the head with an axe. And so the boys strike, and then other miners strike. And then there's some agreement where there's a little bit of wage increase there. But then, so there's a bit of peace, but that peace doesn't last too long, because once the miners see that the money's being taken out of their paychecks, that 3 cents a day, they go on strike all around the Hazleton area. And so the goal of the miners is to close down all the mines. And their goal on September 10th was to close all the mines owned by Calvin Pardee, okay, who owns mines in the Harwood area, which is south of Hazleton, as well as mines in Lattimer. John Fahey comes to town, to Harwood. John Fahey represents the UMWA, the United Mine Workers of America. The United Mine Workers of America supported the Campbell Act, the tax, the 3 cents tax.
They did?
They did, yeah.
Why?
Well, their goal, so the UMWA was a new organization. It was developed in 1890. And their goal was to protect the English speakers and their jobs, and to protect them from what they called the invading hordes, who were taking jobs away and who were working for lower wages and therefore depressing the wages, right? And so the UMWA went to Harrisburg, and they were a major supporter of the Campbell Act.
Was there a union at the time that represented the immigrants?
No, so they were not organized, which is fascinating. So Fahey comes into town, and he is greeted fairly well by the workers, and he talks to them about organizing, and he talks to them about joining the UMWA. But what he also does is he also has some people who could speak Polish and Italian too, who are then translating what he's saying to the new immigrants, because most of them didn't speak English, okay? And they more or less get behind him, and hundreds of miners joined the union on the spot. Fahey's tells them about how to protest, how to march, and to march to Lattimer peacefully. So to me that's stunning that they quickly embraced the UMWA after the UMWA supported this tax. So the workers, it's a Sunday, late Sunday morning. The workers leave Harwood, we think with about 250 men, and as they start marching towards Lattimer, it grows to close to 400 men. But before they actually get to Lattimer, they meet the Sheriff Martin, and his posse on the outskirts of Hazleton, and they were going to march through Hazleton, and the sheriff said, you can't go here, and there's a bit of a kerfuffle, and one of the sheriff's men takes one of the two American flags that the miners are holding and rips it up, which is quite stunning. And one of the sheriff's men clubs one of the miners, and there's reports of somebody having a broken arm and somebody else with some other broken limbs. And the mayor comes out and says, you could have safe passage around the city. Why don't you go this way? And they continue their march to Lattimer. The sheriff and his posse get on these trolleys and they race to Lattimer to meet the workers. And as they're on the trolleys, people hear stories about the posse and what they're saying, and some are talking about shooting and killing, on their way to Lattimer to greet the miners. So the miners start entering the town, and they're on the outskirts of town. And the sheriff and his posse, and the posse are men who are deputized. They're joined by the coal and iron police, which are controlled by the coal company. And they form a line in front of a house, which is also in front of one of the coal mines, which is where the workers want to go to close down the mine. And they create this really interesting formation where they have a line here, and then there's the trolley tracks over here with a 3-foot berm, and the miners are walking into this position, which in the military you would call a flanking position, because all the sheriff's men are here. You have this 3-foot berm over here, so it's like they're going into this funnel, okay? They're going into this funnel. The sheriff comes out and greets the miners and says, he asks them to call their march off, and the miners respond and say, but this is a public road and we have a right to be here, as they're holding an American flag, as they are unarmed. And there's no clear picture of what happens next. People from the back are pushing forward because they want to move forward. Somebody yells fire, and there's different stories about who actually yells fire, and they start firing into the group of men. Several fall immediately, and after that initial firing, the men start running away, and as they start running away, the sheriff and the posse start following them, and they shoot them down in the backs, okay? 19 men end up dying at the site, and we think an additional 6 people die afterwards from wounds. And when they do the autopsy of the men who died, 19 of them died from shots either on the side or in the back. So most of them are being hunted down, okay, as they're running away. And so it's a major tragedy, It's an episode that happens in about 2 minutes. People describe it as like hearing firecrackers, just a bunch of shots going off. in a span of 2 minutes. And some people come to the rescue of the dying. There's a story of a school teacher. There's a schoolhouse nearby, and some of the men were actually running towards the schoolhouse, and the sheriff's men went on top of the berm, which is actually here. They went on top of the berm, and they fired into the men towards the schoolhouse. Okay, and again, documentation saying how they died, within feet of reaching the schoolhouse, and the schoolhouse was riddled with bullets. The school teacher came out. She tore her petticoat, and she tried to help one of the men who were shot in the stomach, and by wrapping it together, and the man died. She was later blacklisted for helping the man who was dying. So it's a major tragedy that happens. People are upset. People start protesting. Fahey from the UMWA is telling the workers to be calm. There's another very interesting character in all this is Father Aust, A-U-S-T, who comes to the aid of the workers, and during the funeral processions and during the time of mourning, he talks to to his parishioners to be calm and not to take revenge and be peaceful, and he ends up aiding the workers and the families later on. I mean, there's this wonderful, for me, it's this really wonderful story about how the church came to the aid of these workers and created an organization to help the families who have lost husbands and the main breadwinners in the family. And I say it's a wonderful story because when I've done research in other industrial places, like in the Northeast, sometimes the Catholic Church was in the back pockets of the industrialists, and they often preached about, saying life here is okay. You could work hard and be exploited, but your afterlife is, you'll have a better afterlife. But here the Catholic Church came to the rescue of these men, and they were at odds with capital. They were at odds with the coal barons, and they really made an effort to rescue these people and to help these people. And it's a tradition that kept on going for generations afterwards. And so in the book I have some quotes from bishops who come to Lattimer later on in the 1970s and 1990s, and they talk about the poverty that's so prevalent in northeastern Pennsylvania, and they talk about income inequity and how we need to pay attention to these things, and so what's clear is that a lot of these clergy who come to Lattimer in the 1970s and through the 90s are offspring of coal miners too. And so they really understand the plight of the miners and what's going on with the miners. So
how was the incident reported in the newspapers at the time, in the local newspapers in particular in Hazleton?
So that's interesting too, is that there are different versions about what happened at Lattimer. So there's on the local level, there were pro-capital and pro-labor newspapers, and so the titles are very different, and the descriptions are very different, and so that's the amazing thing about Lattimer, and even to this day, people have different opinions about what happened at Lattimer. And was it a massacre or was it a riot, right? And so the community was very divided. Were you were you pro-labor, meaning were you one of the miners or miners belonged to one of the miners' families, or were you pro-capital, one of the businessmen in the community? And so the community, based on what I've seen, was pretty much divided about how they viewed Lattimer. There were many more miners than there were business owners in the area.
So there were newspapers in Hazleton that were unashamedly pro-strikers?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So there were. And
knowing that the coal companies controlled the town.
But it was also the people who purchased the newspapers, so they were also catering to the people who were purchasing the newspapers, too. And so there were very different versions of that. And then on the national level, they were very divided, too.
I want to read you a couple quotes. You
Okay.
have in here, the New York Times wrote that the sheriff's actions probably stopped an episode of widespread killing and looting. The Washington Star described the strikers as ignorant men and a dangerous class, and the Pittsburgh Gazette described the strikers as vicious fellows.
Doesn't that blow you away? It blows me away. I mean, so that shows you about it. What's really fascinating about that is that you have an incident of great magnitude, but yet there's very different perspectives of what it is. So it's how do we create history, right? And how do we report history? And there are very different perspectives on one event about how people are described. And so that's the fascination about Lattimer. And then you have the Slovak language newspapers that that show the injustice of the whole thing, and they talk about the murderers, and the murderers are the sheriff and his men at Lattimer, and so there's very different perspectives, and so that's really key to the story of Lattimer. It's key to the story of Lattimer on September 10th, 1897, and still key to the story of Lattimer today. People still have very different perspectives about what happened at Lattimer.
Well, you're right about that, and how there's the St. Stanislaus Cemetery is where a lot of the people are buried, and some of the markers have been vandalized, or to this day.
To this day, yeah. So, and I was at a public meeting in Hazleton related to issues of immigration, and then I met a faculty member there from Wilkes College, and he came up to me and he said, I grew up in Lattimer, and we started talking, and he said, I would sometimes visit the cemeteries, the St. Stanislaus Cemetery, and people would vandalize the grave markers of the martyrs, right? And by putting mud on the stones. So nobody took an axe to them or anything, but they would just sort of deface them. And I didn't believe that at first. I mean, it's believable, but then one day, I might have been in 2013, I visited the cemetery. I try to visit the cemetery maybe once a year, and I take field school students there, and we talk about Lattimer. And there was mud on Father Aust's gravestone, and it's true. So people, and to me, that was a sign of disrespect of, I think, one of the heroes of Lattimer. This man, Father Aust, came out and worked really hard to feed the people after they lost their husbands, to help the families, and there was mud on his stone, and so that continues today, and it, yeah. So it's hard to believe, and so when I first started working up in northeastern Pennsylvania, which was 2009, 2010, people told me stories about how there's still a division in parts of the community, not all of the community, but parts of the community where people didn't socialize across these social boundaries. So you wouldn't get descendants of miners socializing with descendants of the coal operators necessarily.
Is it still based on ethnicity?
It's based on ethnicity. It's slow. It's quickly disappearing. The ethnic divides as there's a major white flight out of Hazleton, and there's a new Latino population coming in, and the newer generation is not paying as much attention to ethnic divides as maybe they did 1 or 2 generations ago.
I want to talk about that a little bit because it's a part of your book. But as a follow-up to the Lattimer massacre, did that kind of put an end to the union organizing in the area, or did it spur it? Did it close down the mines? What happened after that?
Yeah, so the mines were actually, there's a great story. There was an attempt to reopen the mines immediately after the massacre, and there's this wonderful character named Mary Septak.
Is that Big Mary?
Big Mary. She's known as Big Mary. So some of the men start returning to the Lattimer mines, and Big Mary gathers the women in the town, and they have rolling pins and they have shovels, and as the men start walking towards the mine, they rush down the comb banks and they beat them, and they keep the strike going for about 2 more weeks before the National Guard finally disperses the women. So she's called Big Mary. They're called Amazon women, right? And what's fascinating throughout the whole coal country up there, women play a major role in strikes throughout the area. So if you look at some of the newspapers, some of the regional newspapers up there, there's stories about women leading the strike, women keeping the strike going. And there's no names to them, but they're always called Amazon women, and so that's a fascinating story about how women are disappeared, but yet they did play a major role in the strikes. So to follow up your question, could you repeat your question?
Oh well, what was the upshot?
Oh,
of
the
that?
upshot. Yeah, sure. So so the men go back to work, but the union begins to see a major increase in enrollment, and it's John Mitchell, who's a major hero in northeastern Pennsylvania. There's a statue to him in Scranton.
I think his birthday is still a big day, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's a John Mitchell Day, which is October 29th, which is the date of the settlement of the 1900 strike. So in the 1900 strike, John Mitchell says, it's I'm paraphrasing it here, but he says it's not Slavish coal, it's not Italian coal, it's American coal, and it was his way of trying to unify the workers and to break down the ethnic barriers. And it was 1900 where there was a successful strike. And even more important, there was a strike in 1902, which is probably one of the most important and well-known strikes in American labor history, called the 1902 Anthracite coal strike. And it was successful only because the union was able to incorporate all these foreign-born workers. And they were a major force that they actually had to they actually made a lot of the major companies come in and settle a strike. It was Teddy Roosevelt who actually said, hey, the Northeast is about to freeze. It's October. We don't have coal. Industries are being impacted. You need to settle this. And so they agreed on a commission that would review the working conditions and so forth. And there was a wage increase too. John Mitchell becomes a saint. He's a hero. And if you see pictures of John Mitchell, he has this high collar, and it makes him look very priestly-like, And wherever he walked and wherever he went in northeastern Pennsylvania, he was greeted as though he was a hero or a saint or a martyr. So Some historians may argue this point, but it was Lattimer where the UMWA saw that the foreign workers could be organized and that they could play a major role. And it was at that point where they start to think twice about immigration and ethnicity and the role of these foreign workers in the union. So the UMWA grew after the Lattimer strike. The growth led to a successful 1900 strike and a very successful 1902 strike.
If you visit Lattimer today, what do you see?
If you come in to Lattimer from the western end, you come into the town and there's a fork in the road. And if the part on the left is Lattimer Road, the part on the right is called Quality Road. And there's meaning behind it. And so the locals tell me that Quality Road is where the bosses' houses, the supervisors' houses were located. And the workers and their families were not allowed on Quality Road, okay? So there's that fork in the road, and as you enter town, there's a shale boulder right at that fork. And the shale boulder is about 8 feet tall, and the landscape around it is well groomed. There's some shrubs there and some lawn. And then there's a concrete path that leads up to the boulder, and the boulder has a bronze pick and shovel attached to it, and that boulder also has a bronze plaque that's attached to it. And I just want to read what that bronze plaque says, and it says, Lattimer Massacre, September 10th, 1897. And then it states, it was not a battle because they were not aggressive, nor were they on the defensive because they had no weapons of any kind and were simply shot down like so many worthless objects, each of the licensed life-takers trying to outdo the others in the butchery. I mean, that's a powerful statement, and it was a statement put up by a group from the AFL-CIO and the United Mine Workers of America, and it's dedicated September 10th, 1972.
Well, you said in your book that the creation of that monument was controversial. It took forever for something to unfold.
Well, and that's an important issue, I think. It took 75 years for some sort of memorial to be created there, and so the issue is why. So in 1903, the UMWA made a statement that the workers at Lattimer and the Lattimer Massacre was something that was very important to the UMW and the strength of the UMW, and we ought to memorialize it, right? And so they did some fundraising, and they raised money. And what's interesting is that most of the money that they raised came from outside of Hazleton and not in Hazleton. And there were attempts to construct a monument, an obelisk. You know, the first design, it was 18 feet tall. The next design, it was 30 feet tall. They had the cash to do it, but then they wanted to put it in Lattimer, but Lattimer was owned by the coal company. And so the land wasn't sold off until the late 1930s. So they couldn't put it there. Then there was discussions about, well, maybe we should put it by the cemetery, the St. Stanislaus Cemetery. It never happened. There was discussions about putting it in Wilkes-Barre, because that's the county seat. And then there was discussions in the newspapers, well, we really don't want it here because maybe the workers would organize here and they would protest here and would bring a motley crew into the area, so we don't want it here. And then it disappears from the newspapers. And I think part of it is the Red Scare. People are afraid of unions. They're afraid of the Eastern Europeans. They're afraid of the Red Scare and communism in the 1910s, right? Because of the Bolshevik revolution that occurred in 1917 and so people sort of back off supporting labor and the commemoration of this. There's a 1936 or 37 newspaper article that describes it as a riot, the Lattimer riot. So is it a massacre? Is it a riot? And so that sort of gives you a flavor about how history changes and how perspectives change too. And then in the 1940s, there's a local historian who's wrote a lot about Polish and Polish history, and his name is Ed Pinkowski. And Ed did a few oral histories, and then he wrote this pamphlet or a booklet about the Lattimer massacre. Limited printing, not much distribution, but it sort of sat there as documentation of some of these oral histories of some of the men who were there at the Lattimer massacre. But it sort of disappears. A few people in Hazleton own it, a few people in Lattimer own it. And then there was a historian, Victor Green, who wrote about the Slavic strikes and the Slavic communities on strike. I think it was called 1968. And he found this booklet. And so he actually wrote a few paragraphs about the Lattimer massacre in his book. And so that's sort of the first breath in reinvigorating and bringing to new life the memory of Lattimer.
You say in your book there was an annual memorial in Lattimer and that they stopped doing it?
And it started again, too. So the memorial was created in 1972 with that inscription that I read. And there was a state marker also placed next to it. The Roman Catholic Church at St. Mary's in Lattimer, on September 10th every year, they had a memorial service at the place, at the memorial. I've read different versions that there was a mass and then there was a supper afterwards, or a gathering before, and then a mass, and maybe as many as 200 people would show up for this. So it was, in '72, it was still important to the local community. And then in the early 2000s, a lot of the Catholic churches, some were disbanded and some had to reorganize in northeastern Pennsylvania because the populations were decreasing and so forth. And there was a hiatus for a few years for this memorial service at Lattimer. And then it picked up again. And so the hiatus was about 5 years or so. And it picked up again about the time we started working up there again. Now, did we do that? I don't think so, but it's an interesting coincidence how the memorial service started again. But this time it wasn't just about the Roman Catholic Church. It was a multi-denominational service, and we've recorded it, and it's on YouTube, in fact. So leaders from the different churches participate in the memorial service. And the last one I went to was a couple of years ago, and I'm assuming that it's still continuing up there. I mean, so the clergy who I spoke to who were responsible for it were very pro-labor and thought it was very important that the church sponsor and remember what happened at Lattimer, and in a way to support the working people.
And if you go to Hazleton today, what do you see?
Hazleton is a very different place than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So when I first started going to Hazleton over 10 years ago, most of the downtown was closing up. A few stores were still there. Jimmy's Quick Lunch. We could get great hot dogs, and then there's a great Italian bakery there too, just a few doors down. And then a lot of stores were closed. And what happened in about 2000 was that the state of Pennsylvania created these economic zones to spur development in the economy, and a lot of these box stores moved there, where they have their fulfillment centers like Staples and Amazon.
Warehouses?
Yeah. So if you get something that's from Amazon and it's stamped Pennsylvania, chances are it comes from Hazleton, right? And what we saw starting in the early 2000s is a major influx of Latinos coming into the area. So now today, when you go down the main streets of Hazleton, you see botanicas, and you see Latin American restaurants, and you see food stores, and you hear music in the streets, and it's a very different place. And so Hazleton is now a minority city. So 52% of the city is now people of minority status.
And how is that going down with the long-term residents?
Not too well. But that's also mixed too, just like the history of Lattimer is very mixed. So starting in 2006, the city of Hazleton created this law that made it illegal to rent to undocumented people, to employ undocumented people, to make English the official language of Hazleton. There were rallies in the street. The then mayor held rallies, and one of the U.S. senators from Pennsylvania was part of the rallies. It created this real fear amongst a lot of the newcomers within the community. And then I've also met a lot of people who said, hey, my ancestors came here 100 years ago. They were new immigrants. They didn't speak English. They had the same concerns as a lot of the new immigrants today, the same concerns about work, about feeding their family, about education. And maybe we should support these people because this is what our families went through. So it's very divided about how people really view the new immigrant in Hazleton. And there's this one organization called the Hazleton Integration Project, which has a school called Hazleton 1 down there, and it was formed by Joe Madden, who was the manager of the Chicago Cubs, right?
And a Hazleton native.
And a Hazleton native. And so Joe Madden comes back a couple of times a year to Hazleton, and he saw what was happening in his community, and he said, I work with Latinos, I coach them, I played with them, I have Thanksgiving dinner with them, and you know what? They want the same thing that my family wanted. And so he created this organization that's run by his relatives right now, who are just wonderful people helping us with our archaeology project as we recruit students from diverse backgrounds. They have this program where these students can go to Hazleton 1 and they could have ESL classes, or there's a playground there, there's a sports complex, they are able to feed people who need nourishment and so forth. So it's pretty incredible. And so when Joe Madden started this, people weren't too happy about that, and they called him an enabler, and that was the talk on the streets. And so in 2006, when this law was created and it was eventually struck down by higher courts, since then, within the last year or two, you now can find newspaper articles in the New York Times or here on radio programs, NPR, talking about the new Hazleton and how Hazleton is being revitalized with the new immigrant population, and how the tax base has increased because there are more businesses, and how the downtown is much better off now with the new businesses in there. But it's still, so that's on the national level, but if you still go through the community, there's still some animosity, about the new immigrant, and I've witnessed that. We have an archaeological field school, and we live in downtown Hazleton, and we live close to the markets, and when I tell people where we live during the summertime, they ask me, well, do you carry a gun? Are you afraid for your life? And yet we socialize with our neighbors, and we share food with our neighbors, and it's a very different culture than what I grew up. It's a porch culture where people are outside and people are talking across the street, and there's music playing, and on the weekends people enjoy their weekends, and it's just a great experience for me, and it's a great experience for our students too, to be a part of this and see what it's like to live in a new immigrant community.
We only have about a minute left, and I don't want this to end before you mentioned archaeology a couple times. You and your students did an archaeological dig in Lattimer?
We've been working in Lattimer for several seasons. So part of it, we did some archaeology to find the impact site of the Lattimer massacre, where we found bullets related to it. But then after that, we were able to connect with some of the neighbors in Lattimer, and we specifically worked in the areas where the new immigrants lived. So when I mentioned earlier in the show how the new immigrants were given a plot of land, and so they built their own shacks, and that's where we did the archaeology, not where the double houses are, where the foremen lived and the miners lived, but we did the archaeology where the laborers lived, and we did an archaeology, and we've been doing archaeology of immigration and what it's like to be a new immigrant, and what the material culture is like, and the stuff that we find and the stuff that we don't find.
And you found bullets from the Lattimer massacre?
We found bullets from the Lattimer massacre dating to the time of the massacre, all around a place where people called the massacre tree for a long time. And a lot of them were impacted and smashed, so they hit something, right? And we found a tin cup, which was probably from a miner, that was filled with buckshot holes. So it's really amazing. I mean, archaeology is really amazing when you could put the tangible to it and find this stuff related that we've read so much about in history.
I wish we could keep talking, but we're out of time. If you want to know more, you have to read the book, Remembering Lattimer, Labor, Migration, and Race in Pennsylvania Anthracite Country. Paul Shackel, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.